Coming up on At Your Service, an important conversation with the Office of Psychological Services and how that office supports the students of Anne Arundel County Public Schools. Welcome to At Your Service. We have with us today the Office of Psychological Services for Anne Arundel County Schools, and we're going to have a conversation about how this office supports the students of Anne Arundel County. And with me, I have my three guests. Could you all introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Kelly Anderson. I'm the Coordinator of Psychological Services.
I'm Heidi Taylor. I'm the Resource Social Worker for the county.
I'm Stephanie Masso. I'm the Resource School Psychologist.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being with us today. So first, can you talk to us just about the role of a school psychologist and school social worker, and then what the difference between the two?
Sure. So one of the things that's important to understand is that school psychologists and social workers, they play a targeted role within the school setting. So that means that unlike school counselors, we're not seeing every kid that's in the school, but we are working with targeted students in the school. School psychologists are specifically trained in both mental health and education strategies, and they enter a very specific training program for school psychology so that they're really anchored towards both the mental health piece of it, but also the academic side of it. So that means we do a lot of work with special education, some work with eligibility for special education, and really trying to help students both with their social emotional needs, but also their academics. Social workers, they're very broadly trained, and then they come to work in the schools. And the social workers do a lot of mental health supports of a variety of students, some with very intense needs, some generally more general needs. And so we really see them as being very specific to the mental health side of things.
And can you tell me how many school psychologists we have in the county and how many school social workers?
Sure. Right now we have 83 school psychologists and 35 social workers.
Okay, great. And so can you talk about how the roles might differ for both the school psychologist and school social worker when it comes to elementary, middle, and high school?
Sure. I'm going to let Steph talk about this elementary.
Yeah. So we're, as Kelly said, we're here to help all kids overcome barriers. In elementary school, the social worker and the school psychologist do have some overlap, but there's one in each building. But the school psychologist in the elementary role will be delivering some targeted services, so providing counseling services, for example. They'll do individual solution-focused counseling where the student may come in with a specific problem. They talk about the problem and then they get back to class. There's targeted group counseling, so for specific targets such as anger management or impulse control. Also, lunch bunch is a big thing in the elementary setting that helps to target and improve social skills for kids. The school psychologists at the elementary level is also going in and doing direct behavior interventions and or academic interventions. With consultation with the teacher, they'll go into the classroom and possibly model, coping skills at the calm down corner, or they will participate in a community circle in the general ed classroom, or they will help to de-escalate a student who might be in crisis. And then lastly, assessment, which is a huge piece of our job in the elementary level, to determine if to gather data and determine if there's an educational disability.
Okay.
Heidi, social workers.
Yes.
Describe elementary, middle, and high school social workers for us.
Okay. In all three levels, as Steph said, we are working hand in hand with the psychologists, with the counselors, and working on counseling and crisis intervention. We may intervene in a variety of crises with all those levels. Your high school students, they're obviously older, and we're dealing with a lot of, unfortunately, suicidal ideation, self-injury, lethality, and risk assessments, and substance abuse. It often comes into play when you're working with high school students. I often will talk to older students about safe relationships and really having good boundaries. Middle school, you're working up to some of that. Elementary school, we're really fortunate to have this year being a wonderful funding year for us to have all these new positions in student services, including a number of new social workers. So we were able to put them in elementary schools to do what I love to do, which is more preventative work. When you're not responding to crises all the time, of course we're there for that, but for example, in my school last year, I got to do a lot of in-class work, broad stroke prevention efforts with coping skills and mindfulness and things like that. So we were able to start them earlier and, teach them resilience and coping skills early on. So that's one thing that I particularly enjoy as a benefit of social workers in the elementary school.
And I would say, just to finish off the psychologist piece, at the secondary level, middle and high school, we do see less of an assessment demand. Lots of times kids already have their disabilities identified, and so we'll see less assessment on the secondary level, more group work, more friendship work, more, what to Heidi's point, some suicidal pieces, supporting students in that way. But certainly at the high school and the middle school level, I think the social worker role and the school psychologist role looks a little more similar. In the elementary schools, it can look quite different, with the school psychologist playing a primarily special education role at times.
Excellent. And so we've recently had a conversation with the Office of School Counseling. What is the difference between a school counselor, a school psychologist, a school social worker, and especially when it comes to parent permission or in terms of seeing the child?
Sure. So I think the broad difference is that school counselors are really trained and intended to be providing those universal supports, so supports to all students in the school. And when you look at, say, in a high school, for example, you might have 6 school counselors where you'll have 1 school psychologist. So as a result of that, the school counselors really are that first front line of defense for any supports that a child might need. We're kind of at that second level, more of a targeted interventions. And so because of that, we want to make sure that parents are informed if we're going to work with their child. A school counselor is obviously available to work with any student in the building. The school psychologist or the school social worker can be a little less obvious, so we want to make sure that we're getting that good homeschool connection if we're going to start to work with a child.
Excellent. So if a parent wanted to have, maybe they've talked to the school counselor, but they want some more targeted support, how would they find out how to get access to their school psychologist or school social worker?
Yeah, I think it's best that they know that there is a school psychologist in every single building, but at the different levels. They're there different days of the week. Some are there full-time, others are there 1 or 2 days a week or more. So it's actually just best to call the school building to find out who the school psychologist is and when they are available. So just best advice is to call the school building to find out social worker and school psych.
And Heidi, talk about social workers, not available in every building.
Right. That would be my dream, that social workers could be at least 1 or 2 days in every school, but we are getting there. Anyway, yes, they could certainly call the school, find out, and we're fortunate to have gotten more visibility in the schools this year, so grateful for that.
Yeah, so I would say certainly a parent could call the school and expect to find out who their school psychologist is. They should be aware that they may not be able to find out the social worker because there might not be a social worker placed in their school.
Excellent. So what I'm hearing too is that children who have individualized education plan or in special ed, they're not the only children that school psychologists or school social workers would see. They may see kids that have an individualized education plan, or they may see kids that do not. Is that correct?
Sure. I mean, I think it depends a little bit on how much time the service provider is in the building. So, for example, if a school psychologist is in a building 1 day a week, it's pretty unlikely that they'll have time to see other general ed kids. That, to Heidi's point, is really our goal, is to be broadly in the schools so that we are able to serve kids with special education needs as well as general ed kids. We don't always have that luxury, but it's always a good question worth asking.
Good, and that's a good clarification. So what is the difference between the support that a school psychologist or a school social worker gives and that of someone who provides private therapy and private practice or outside of the school system?
Well, and that's a great question, Ryan, because I think that a lot of people have that question. There's a lot of confusion. One of the things that we are always working on is making sure that we are addressing the educational impact and the academic needs of the student. So, for example, if you have a mental health concern and it's impacting your ability to concentrate in class or to stay in class or to do something like that, that's an appropriate role for a school psychologist or a school social worker. We don't do all forms of family therapy. We don't do all forms of therapy. So you don't want to think of us necessarily as a replacement for outside support. oftentimes it works best if we're working in conjunction with a private provider. And actually, Steph, I think you have a good example of a concern that would be more appropriately addressed by a private provider.
Yeah, so as Kelly said, we look at educational impact and helping kids to overcome those barriers for socio-emotional and behavioral. But if there is a family that's experiencing a change in situations such as a divorce, and the student might be showing some concerning behaviors in the home setting, yet is not showing any concerning behaviors in the school setting, then that would be an example that there wouldn't really be an educational impact, that would be more for a family to seek out a private therapist.
Okay.
Heidi, you were thinking of one too.
Yeah, something that comes to mind was like if a child has gone through an unfortunate trauma of abuse, sexual or physical abuse or neglect, something very acute like that, that's probably, they're going to need ongoing treatment. Plus the nature of the topic is not something that you necessarily want to, oh, I'm going to work on my trauma and then I'm going to go back to math. It's too much for the school setting. In those situations, we might recommend that a person have an outside therapist.
And too, Ryan, I think, we don't see kids over the summer. So if it's an ongoing concern, like what Heidi was talking about, or something that's really difficult, it's hard to come out of math class and talk about your trauma and then dry your tears and go back into math class. But also what happens in the summer? How are you getting supported in the summer or on Christmas break or when we're having some holiday breaks? So we really look at school work as really being, we have to be connected to the purpose of school, which is the academics, and also balancing. Every time we take you out of class, you're missing some instruction. And so we try to work with students and families to kind of find that balance point.
Excellent. So with about a minute and a half to break, can you talk about some of the challenges that you all face as school psychologists and school social workers?
Sure. I think the biggest challenge is certainly the scarcity. As you know, in Anne Arundel County, we have a lot more mental health needs than we have providers. We've had a great budget year in terms of our staffing, but we still don't have as many supports as we would like to have. And I think behaviorally, I think that's another challenge that we're seeing in the elementary schools.
Absolutely, and I think in all the schools, but definitely the younger students are showing more significant concerning behaviors that are definitely being displayed in the school setting. So it's all of the other job responsibilities, and then on top of that, a lot of challenging behaviors.
And I think we are seeing mental health challenges at younger ages. When you look at our data, you certainly see what you used to assume was a high school problem now is at the middle school level. Suicidal thoughts might be at the elementary school level, which feels different and unheard of to people, but really is an impact that we're seeing.
And how is that, with seeing that as younger and younger, the challenges, how have you changed your staffing model or how you're supporting schools?
We are working very hard to get more supports, mental health supports, into the elementary schools. This year we were able to have school psychologists only have 2 elementary schools at most instead of 3. We're also, as Heidi said, putting social workers into elementary schools as well, and partnering with our school counselors as they have increased their staffing too.
Great, awesome. All right, well, coming up next on At Your Service, we're going to continue our conversation with the Office of Psychological Services and talk more about how they support students in the schools.
Do you have children currently in or about to enter Anne Arundel County Public Schools? Would you like to join other families, community members, and educators to share ideas and address issues that support the academic success and overall well-being of our children? If so, please join us on Saturday, November 16th for our Family Involvement Conference. The theme of this year's conference is All Means All, embracing and learning through our diversity. The event is free and open to all interested family and community members. It will be held at the Anne Arundel Community College in Arnold and runs from 8:30 a.m. until 1 p.m. The morning will begin with the opportunity to visit a variety of community resource tables, followed by welcoming remarks from Superintendent Dr. George Arlotto. Participants will then choose 2 engaging workshops from among 13 different topics to attend for the remainder of the day. Continental breakfast and an afternoon snack will be provided, and childcare is available for children ages 3 through 12 in the campus Child Development Center. Please note, however, that the number of available spaces is limited and registration for childcare is required. Those interested in childcare should call 410-222-5309. Per AACC rules, children under the age of 16 may not accompany parents into conference sessions. For more details and to register for the conference, please visit our conference website at www.aacps.org/familyconference. Spanish interpreters will be available for the day of the conference. For interpretation in other languages, please call 410-222-5418. Watch for a flyer with more information coming home with your child, and plan to join us on Saturday, November 16th for another exciting family involvement conference.
Well, thank you all for explaining the role of the school psychologist and school social work to our audience. I had one more follow-up question with that. If parents, if their child is seeing a school social worker or a school psychologist, can you talk a little bit about confidentiality? What would be kept private and what would be shared with parents?
Sure. And I think that's an important question for parents to understand what expectations of privacy their child can have. First and most important thing to know is that a school psychologist or a social worker will go over the rules of confidentiality with the child in their first session, and will also make that information available to parents. So there's very clear guidelines about what will be kept confidential and what won't be. In general, what we don't keep confidential is when a child is saying something about wanting to hurt themselves or wanting to hurt others, or if they're reporting that they're being abused. All of those things, which you can actually find within our policy and regulations, GAD and GADRA, around what's confidential communications, all of that is available for parents to look at. But I'm going to have Steph and Heidi give us some examples of what it might look like at the different levels of confidentiality.
Yeah, and in the elementary level, obviously you need to take into account the developmental level of the student that you're working with. And you're going to kind of break that down into, friendly terms and things like that. But the bottom line and the message that we send to any child is exactly what Kelly just said, and that if you are in jeopardy of harming yourself or others, then we'll need to let other people know about the contents of our session. Other than that, then what is said in this room stays in this room. So that's how we really explain it to the elementary level.
And how about the secondary, Heidi?
Sure. As you have teenagers, they're definitely they're not always quick to trust, so that confidentiality conversation is something that we have always in the beginning. It's very similar to elementary, although the words are different when I'm explaining that to an older student. We'd talk the things that can't be kept private are if you're going to harm yourself, or if you have harmed yourself in a self-injury, or if you want to hurt yourself or die, or things like that. If someone is being hurt at home, of course. So teenagers, they might talk about specifics about their relationships. And they need to have the freedom to be able to do that within a safe counseling situation. So it tends to be maybe what I share with parents is a little less than what I would share with parents, certainly in an elementary setting.
Yeah, and the confidentiality with elementary school level too. Sometimes teachers or parents will think, okay, you're meeting with a student, and then they'll come and, well, I want to know exactly what was said during the session, and that's common because they think they're young kids and they're sharing. I'm the parent, I have the right to know everything. So it's definitely shared with the parents and teachers as well. That the confidentiality is across all grade levels, no matter how young the student is. And again, it's really only broken in the cases of if a student is going to harm themselves or someone else.
And that safety piece is really, and sometimes you get adolescents who are very mad that you would share their secrets, but we always explain to them that the number one priority that we have is keeping them safe, and sometimes we can't help keep them safe all by themselves, so we have to share it with other people. And usually, in my experience, adolescents, even if they're mad at you in the beginning, they'll come around to it as they're getting support. And that goes true for if they're threatening to hurt themselves, or if they're threatening to hurt others, or if they hear of a threat to hurt other people. That can be something that we don't keep confidential either.
Great, thank you. So on kind of a segue to that, when we're talking about topics that that aren't confidential, school safety and threats of harm to others, can you talk about the role of or the expertise of when it comes to school psychologists, school social workers around the area of of threats of harm to others?
Sure. And I think this is an area where we really share with parents the worry that something bad could happen, that an act of violence could happen that would be terrible to their children and to the school as a whole. And so we've really worked hard in the Office of Psych Services to put a lot of supports and plans in place so that we're very active in our pursuits of making sure that kids are safe, not just from acts of self-harm, but acts of harm from other people. I don't know if you know, Ryan, but there's the Safe to Learn Act from 2018, which was signed by Governor Hogan. We've worked on that act. And so that act requires that every school district has a behavioral threat assessment process and a threat assessment team to examine that process. We're very fortunate in Anne Arundel County that we have been having that process for about 5 years now. So we didn't have to start from scratch when that law came out, but what we did was make some tweaks to make sure that it's very transparent to schools, to families, to the community at large, what our process is. And again, that's actually a policy and regulation that if parents are interested, they can read on the board policies. I believe it's policy JN, Ryan, I think. JN and JNRA. So all the details are public about how we engage the threat assessment process.
So can you talk a little bit? I know in that regulation it pretty much lays out what our protocol is for a threat assessment. Can you talk about that in more detail?
Sure. One of the things that's most important to understand is that oftentimes kids might make a threat they don't mean. And so one of the things that we really needed in Anne Arundel was we needed a process where we could differentiate between the threats that are serious and significant and the threats that are just kids having a bad day, or we've all maybe had the experience where we've made a threat. I always joke that when my husband doesn't unload the dishwasher, I threaten to kill him. And that's not really a threat that I mean. That's what we would call a transient threat, which means it's sort of like in the heat of the moment. And so in Anne Arundel, we have designed our threat assessment process around the work of Dewey Cornell from the University of Virginia, and he has really good language and understanding for us about how to work to make sure that we're differentiating between kids who are saying threats when they're mad or maybe they don't have any other words to use, and kids who are saying threats and they mean it. And that's a really important distinction. I know, Steph, in your work at an elementary school, you saw kids making threats sort of all the time out of the heat of the moment.
Right, and when we go through the process of the way that it's written, you can kind of identify that information pretty quickly. And if it is transient, then really there's not much more other than talking to the student and making sure that they're not going to harm anybody else. But there are processes and procedures in place that if the administrator as the team lead and then other people from the threat assessment team determine that this might be something more significant, we call it substantive or very substantive, that there's processes that we can kind of determine that as well, put interventions in place for the student and or victim, and have that as a whole process for ACPS.
And I think, Ryan, probably at the heart of our process is the notion that really the best way to keep kids safe in school is to resolve the need for the threat in the first place. So it can be counterintuitive sometimes to feel like you want to work with the child who's making the threats. But really the best way that we can ensure safety is by working with a child, helping them resolve whatever grievance it might be that they have, or making sure that they're getting the supports that they need. Sometimes, for example, a child with a disability might be making some threats because they don't have new language to express their frustration without making it into a harm statement. Heidi, I think you had that experience.
And working in the elementary schools, I would see that more often, I guess, than I would have thought. Students making self-harm statements that they want to die and they want to kill themselves. It's almost hard to imagine a young person saying that. But in further assessment, all of our school social workers and school psychologists are skilled clinicians, and we do an assessment process. And a lot of times I would find out that it wasn't that they really wanted to end their lives. They didn't have the language to express how angry they were feeling.
And I think the same
At
is
the
true
time.
Threats against other people
And
as
exactly.
well. Yeah,
You really don't want to harm someone else in that way. But so we work with a lot of preventative measures when we can, giving them the language to be able to express themselves appropriately and cope with minor stressors so that they don't have to go to that extreme.
And do you work with parents then and collaborate with other outside resources for these students? Can you talk a little bit about that, what that might look like?
Sure. So the threat assessment process is very much intended to be a team process, and we really look to parents to be a key part of that team, because parents have a lot of access to information about how a child is at home that we don't see, and we have the school view, so we can kind of share and get the full picture of the child when we're able to collaborate with the parent. We do often make recommendations for outside therapists, or if they're already working with a therapist, how can we help work to resolve some of the distress that a child is experiencing that has kind of brought them to this place of wanting to do harm, either to themselves or to other people.
Great. And so as a parent, what if you know of a threat that someone's made, whether it's your own child or someone in your neighborhood? What advice or recommendations can you give to that parent?
So I think that the most important thing is the notion of see something, say something. We really want to encourage parents, we want to encourage kids, we want to encourage that communication come forward to the school. So one option would be to call your school's administrator and report what you've seen. There's also an Anne Arundel County hotline where you can report information, and you can even report information anonymously if you don't feel comfortable reporting your full name. But most important that we know is that there's always a path in which there was time between when a person started thinking about hurting themselves and when they actually do it, or thinking about hurting others and doing it. And so if we can get those clues into us, then we can help work and solve the problem that way. So we encourage all parents and students to report anything that they're hearing that's sort of scary to them.
And would the same go for social media if they're seeing things on social media, or is there any kind of difference when it comes to those kinds of threats and handling it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think there's any difference in terms of how you report it. Sometimes on social media, you're able to screenshot it or somehow capture it, which can be very helpful as kind of bringing in some evidence to say, look, I saw it and this is what it is. And, you know, we have to remember that oftentimes kids say things they don't mean. So we don't want to overreact when we see something that's concerning, but we want to bring it to the attention so that we can do the threat investigation piece, so that we can figure out whether or not this is something to be worried about or not.
And as always, if the threat is to a level where, you know, they feel like it might be, a parent sees an imminent threat, always contact 911.
Sure. Yeah. And I will say we have a great partnership with the Anne Arundel County Police, Annapolis City Police, and so they're very well versed in helping us partner, making sure that that information is getting shared with the schools as well, so that we can be good collaborators.
Good. And with about a minute left, you had mentioned administrators being a part of this team. Can you just clarify the role of the school psychologist or school social worker and the administrator, and what the difference might be in terms of the process?
Sure. And an administrator oftentimes kind of wears two hats in that process. One is going to be they're going to be in charge of the discipline aspects of it. That's not something that a school psychologist or a social worker will get involved in terms of the deciding of the discipline and the giving of the consequences. The school psychologist and social worker really is on that intervention side, trying to figure out what's going on. Does a child need some help? That kind of a thing. The administrator will initiate the threat assessment team, because often what happens in a school is that an administrator hears it first. And then they have two things to decide. They have to decide on discipline, but they also have to decide on whether or not a threat assessment team needs to be activated.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, I just want to thank you all for this conversation. This has been very enlightening, and I'm sure we could talk more about a variety of topics, but it's really important that parents understand the role of the school psychologist and school social worker, and then how they can get that support for their child at school. So I just want to thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
I also want to thank you all for watching At Your Service. Have a great day.
Hi, I'm Jeannie Porter. Anne Arundel County Public Schools Department of Transportation is raising the level of awareness for the safety of your children as we transport them to and from school. When a school bus stops to load students, as a driver, this is what you will see. At 150 feet, the bus will activate hazard lights. At 100 feet, the bus driver will activate the amber lights. They will start slowing down. At 10 feet before the bus stops, they will turn on the red bus lights. Their stop sign will come out, and students will begin to load. Once all students are on board safely, the bus driver will turn off red lights and move forward. At this time, it is safe for the motorist to resume movement.